This is Left Voices for Friday, March 7th, 2014. I'm Andrea Sears. Tonight,
this is even more critical now when we look at the Obama administration really stepping up immigration enforcement, putting more and more people in immigration detention than we saw in the previous administration, so that this type of abuse is even more likely to happen without accountability.
DHS advances efforts to prevent sexual abuse of those held in immigration detention. The Department of Homeland Security says it has finalized its Prison Rape Elimination Act standards for immigration detention facilities. The regulations establish a zero-tolerance policy for any sexual abuse of immigration detainees. They also require mandatory training for all staff and at least one outside audit for compliance at every facility every 3 years. Though the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, became law over a decade ago, the Department of Justice issued a rule in 2012 that excluded immigration detention facilities from coverage under PREA. The standards released today are in response to a landmark 2012 executive memorandum from President Obama clarifying that PREA applies to all federal agencies with confinement facilities and to a 2013 congressional mandate. DHS released a draft of its standards in January of last year. Prisoner rights advocates say that draft had some serious shortcomings, but the final standards released today are considerably stronger.
They provide some very important tools for DHS to finally start seriously addressing its problem of sexual abuse in immigration detention facilities.
Amy Fettig is Senior Staff Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union's National Prison Project.
Unfortunately, DHS did not fully address all of the issues raised by the advocacy community, but I will point to some important things that they did. For example, DHS clarified that for its contract facilities, and remember, a lot of immigration detainees are held in private or local contract facilities. What DHS is now saying is that these standards apply to those facilities, not just when there are new contracts. They're also saying that any time contracts are modified or renewed, the PREA standards now apply to those facilities. So that provides more protections for individuals who are going to be detained in these private immigration detention beds.
What's been the problem with the way reports of sexual abuse in detention facilities have been handled in the past?
What we've seen is, quite frankly, a problem of taking sexual abuse complaints seriously, a problem with actually investigating these complaints, and quite frankly, I would say overall a lack of oversight. So what's happening in these local facilities, what's happening in DHS facilities themselves, there hasn't been the type of scrutiny we need to prevent sexual abuse in detention settings. But now, with the new PREA regulations, we hope that these regulations for the first time will really provide increased tools, increased oversight, and increased accountability, so we don't see people subject to sexual abuse in immigration detention. And when they are, we see DHS and administrative authorities taking action to prevent sexual abuse from happening again.
How prevalent or pervasive are rape and sexual assault in immigration detention facilities?
Well, sexual abuse is too common whenever it happens. Quite frankly, massive FOIA attempts were made to find out really what was happening behind immigration walls, detention walls, and problems were uncovered. And part of that problem was that the victims were being deported so that their voices weren't heard, or they weren't heard until very late in the game. We're hoping that PREA will prevent this type of action from happening, not only for individuals in ICE detention, but for individuals held in those private facilities. And quite frankly, we're talking about thousands of people. So this is even more critical now when we look at the Obama administration really stepping up immigration enforcement, putting more and more people in immigration detention than we saw in the previous administrations, so that this type of abuse is even more likely to happen without accountability. And that's why these DHS PREA regulations are so important and so critical right now.
I understand that the regulations don't have a very firm implementation deadline, though. What are the implementation deadlines? When will these go into full effect?
Well, we will see them really coming into effect once the audit cycles get going. And under the regulations, every DHS facility and every facility that contracts with DHS that's now subject to these PREA regulations, they have to be audited by an outside auditor at least once every 3 years. Now, that does give facilities a little while to actually get implementing these PREA regulations. We'd like to see them implemented today, but it is true that it will take some time, especially to have meaningful implementation. So what we're looking forward to is the rigorous outside auditing of compliance with these regulations. And that's really the key here, because it's very easy to write policies that look good on paper. It's much more difficult to actually implement those policies and make them real on the ground. That's where we're going to see the rubber hit the road. Once the audits start coming in, and importantly, these audits have to be public. So it's going to be incumbent upon the public, advocacy organizations, immigrants' rights groups, to really ensure that these audits are rigorous, to look at what's coming out of these audits, and to ensure that if compliance isn't found, there's an outside voice calling for more rigorous implementation.
The Prison Rape Elimination Act became law more than 10 years ago, but in 2012, the Justice Department issued rules that excluded immigration detention facilities. Why were they excluded at that point?
Well, we thought that was the wrong decision. And really, it came down to agency jurisdiction, where the administration said basically PREA applies to all the federal agencies, but they get to decide what their own regulations are going to look like. So in 2012, DOJ finalized their regulations, and those regulations are quite strong. Unfortunately, DHS was given 2 more years, or actually it blew its deadline. It took 2 more years to actually finalize its own PREA standards. And now there are some ways that these standards are not quite as rigorous as the DOJ standards, and I want to point that out, because what the DOJ said is that there need to be some special protection for transgender prisoners because they're uniquely vulnerable. And so it set up several requirements that will make transgender prisoners safer if followed. For example, separate showering accommodations. In the intake and decisions about housing, asking the individual where they feel safer, in a women's facility or a men's facility. Going by gender identity rather than genitalia. That is a very important measure. But unfortunately, ICE and DHS has decided not to adopt those provisions of the DOJ PREA standards, which is very, very disappointing. They are weaker. There's no question about that. For transgender detainees, they are not as protected as transgender prisoners under the DOJ regulations. We hope that DHS will see fit to correct and strengthen some of these provisions, but right now, those protections simply aren't in there.
What about monitoring? How will you know if these provisions are being implemented and are effective?
It's going to come down to the public nature of the audits of each of these facilities. So even though we've got the regulations on the books, and the regulations are certainly better than what existed before, and if implemented correctly and strongly, they'd go a long way to eliminating the problem of sexual abuse for immigration detainees. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. What are these audits going to look like? Are they going to show that these facilities are complying? Are they going to be rigorous audits? Time will tell, and it is incumbent both on DHS and on the public at large and our leaders in Congress to ensure that PREA is fully implemented in these DHS facilities and in contract facilities, that it's taken seriously, it's implemented rigorously, and it's audited with a great deal of strength and rigor as well. We want robust audits and honest audits as well.
Amy Fettig is Senior Staff Counsel for the National Prison Project of the American Civil Liberties Union. This has been Left Voices for Friday, March 7th, 2014. You can help support this experiment in independent journalism by visiting our website at www.leftvoices.net and following the link at the top of the page. Join us again next week for more news and information from a progressive perspective. I'm Andrea Sears for leftvoices.net.